The Change Media Network.
The Imperfect Activist talks all things youth activism, advocacy, and change-making. We address some of the most pressing environmental and social issues while reconciling with the challenges that come with growing up and transitioning into adulthood.
We shed light and face head-on the hot takes of youth activism and climate organising that are uncomfortable to discuss. This podcast will be a brave space where uncomfortable truths are learned and tricky questions are debated.
Because to become stronger, more united and more efficient as a demographic, we need to figure out what real solidarity looks like before we move forward to confront other societal issues with the urgency that is needed.
The Imperfect Activist follows the belief that we don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones. Famous words by youth activist and environmentalist Clover Hogan. Meet your hosts.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Annabelle.
I'm Natasha, and we're excited to talk all things activism and organising with you, chatting with young changemakers from across the globe.
We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones.
Young people, well, we're the future. We've got everything to fight for.
In this second episode of The Imperfect Activist, we take a raw and honest look at what's happening across the globe, from ongoing wars and rising authoritarianism to political power shifts like the continued influence of Donald Trump. But we're not just listing headlines, we're asking, what do these events mean for young people?
As youth activists in 2025, we feel the gap between our values and the decisions made by those in power growing wider. This episode is a deep dive into the frustration, urgency, and responsibility we feel in the face of global unrest. From Gaza to Ukraine, from climate inaction to growing disillusionment with traditional politics, we are impacting the emotional and political toll it takes on our generation and what it means to show up imperfectly but intentionally.
Nice. Yeah. So there's lots going on in the world, isn't there? At the moment, it's all quite scary. Yeah, I'm thinking, should we give a little overview of like some of the things that feel really like overbearing in the world right now, like some of the conflicts? So obviously, like I feel like a big one for me personally, it's been on my mind for the last couple of years, is Gaza and the genocide being inflicted on Palestine at the moment by Israel. And yeah, I think it really intersects with kind of climate activism, and I've been doing a lot of work with like trying to connect those two movements a bit more. But yeah, it's quite scary that that's still going on. Well, it has. Gaza is obviously in Palestine, has been under occupation for 75 years before that, but it's so interesting with the recent kind of genocide that's taking place, like what the media is portraying and what not, and how much we talk about it and how not. But it's quite scary to think about and to feel quite powerless in the face of that. But yeah, and then there's also
I feel like I think it was last week or beginning of this week, one of the humanitarian ships where Greta Thunberg was supposed to be on got bombarded by Israel on the coast of Malta, I think it was. But just the fact of bombarding and humanitarian boats with resources, food, water for Israel, for Gaza and Palestine people is just very much like against human rights, against international law. And the fact that Israel is not having any repercussion on that, I feel like our voices as young people are where this conflict becomes very important to us, because we can definitely see the non-respect of these laws, but also against a certain ethnic minority group in a country where they didn't particularly decide where they should live. It was put on them 75 years ago by United Nations. And just, seeing all the people that are dying, suffering in Gaza, and no one actually doing anything to stop Israel to attack, but also on the Hamas side, also killing in Israel is not okay as well. But when you value the burden in terms of like bodies and death, Israel has surely gone way above and beyond to kill all those children and young people. I've got a number in my head, but it's probably way more by now. But I had last year when I was at uni, I remember we wrote the 40,000 names of the young people, children, women that died from October 7th. But I would pretty sure now that this is probably more around 60k, I would say, but needs to be verified. But yeah, it's just very unsettling, I feel like, that this injustice is happening, and young people are probably the only ones that are trying to change it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's also unsettling, especially just given how prolonged it has been. And obviously, as was mentioned before, this goes back decades, but within the past like 2 to 3 years, really, we've seen such an exacerbation and I guess like exposure of all of the injustices going on. And I think as young people, especially activists who have maybe attended, you know, United Nations conferences or other conferences related to, I don't know, the United Nations and other of these like IGOs, I think a lot of young people previously saw the United Nations as some, maybe not, I guess, like ultimate power, but as a body who had more authority. And that perception, I think, has crumbled for a lot of young people and has really reconfigured how we view, I guess, like things like diplomatic relations and how the global community, like how much accountability we can actually like hold for other countries, and how much, you know, bodies like the United Nations rely on just genuine collaboration from everyone's part. So I think, yeah, drawing back this towards like a youth perspective, that's kind of what's been on my mind. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I had an example. Last year, actually, I attended the European youth events at the European Parliament in Brussels. And it was like 3 days of like talks and workshops and activities for young people across Europe. And Ukraine was mentioned as well, but Gaza wasn't mentioned whatsoever. And a lot of young people felt like this needed to be addressed, and it was bubbling up, I would say. So not until the closing ceremony in the circle room that someone started screaming "Free Palestine" with a flag and everything, and like slowly more young people were joining him as well. But then the parliamentary were like, we needed to not speak our voices in that room because Gaza was not on their agendas, I would say. But you could see that this was an important subject for young people inside this room, and not just the Ukraine war, but also Gaza and Israel, and needed to be addressed. And at that time, and still not right now, but Europe didn't do anything about Gaza and Israel. And I think young people needed those answers. And I feel like Annabelle just said, like, it also proves that the UN, United Nations, not what is their role in those kind of international conflicts and humanitarian crises. They don't actually stop them. They may be helping them on the ground, but they don't have any authority on who's going to stop this war or not. And I feel like, but why do we have the United Nations then? But that's a whole other question. But I think young people deserve also to have an answer of like making countries accountable and making politicians and members of armed military groups that shouldn't be killing random people just in the name of a religion or just in the name of a homeland or that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think we've really seen our generation kind of like really kind of use their voices more than any other generation on this. I feel like Israel and Netanyahu have broken all international laws, and like you're saying, like all these bodies like the UN is just don't seem to be speaking up. I think we've seen young people crying out about the fact about that. You know, this is the most well documented genocide in history. that's been stated. That's a fact. We've seen, the journalists inside Gaza have been documenting it for everyone outside, and that does show something about our generation, I think, because a lot of them are young people who are documenting this on TikTok, Instagram, and as much as we say, like, our generation, constantly doom scrolling, constantly on their phones, we have seen a whole new wave of activists, I think, through this kind of lens of documenting what is going on and documenting the fact that it's absolutely ludicrous and wrong. And I think that has felt somewhat empowering to me, like just seeing young people kind of take to their phones, but then using that energy to take to the streets and engaging in direct action and stuff like that, which they're also documenting and things like that. And I think, but largely I do think as a society, as a generation, but everyone, all generations are like completely numb to it. Like, it feels like you say, I think, Annabelle, like, it's been going on for so long that it's like, we're just so numb to it now. We're just so numb to seeing martyred bodies on our screens and things like that. And it's like, that's really, really concerning. And to think that we're growing up in a world that, like, where young people just think that's okay to just kind of see that on a daily basis. It's like, no.
Mm-hmm. I think, that definitely resonates with me. I think a lot about, globalization or technology and how it has connected us with communities all over the world, and we're able to constantly see, everything that's happening all over the world. But I often think about how, like, maybe the human brain wasn't meant to be able to process just so much high level and like hard-hitting information constantly all the time. When we talk about like doom scrolling as well, sometimes my algorithm will be a crazy news headline and then like a joke when I swipe away next, and I can't imagine how my brain is processing that. And so I do think apathy, it's really hard. Like, apathy, I feel like for some people is a way to protect themselves, especially when they're in a situation where they know realistically they don't hold that much power in society or leverage to change systems as an individual, and so that apathy is a way to protect themselves. But at the same time, it's not really getting us anywhere. Like, there needs to be this activism, and I don't think it's unique to like our specific generation, like people born between these certain decades, but it's been just young people historically have been some of the, I think, greatest agents for change making, and really highlighting injustices in society.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like even with like the Ukraine conflict, when it started, you could see that young people actually going in communities and helping other people, Ukrainian refugees, to go to Poland or the countries that attached to Ukraine, and just seeing the fact that communities and young people were rallying together for this cause when it didn't affect them directly, but still having a lot of empathy towards people. And I feel like young people do have it a bit more, I would say, just in terms of like helping out. And you could see it during the Ukraine and Russia. Even when I was even not in Europe, I could see it in the medias and it was everywhere. Even TikTok, Instagram went wild on it. And I feel like this is probably, for once, how we like to have news and like know what's going on the ground. And like you said, Natasha, like young people that are journalists on the grounds in these conflicts actually see the reality of it. It's not sort of like washed through media, and you've got the media representation of it. Depending on which politician is attached to that media, you have like different opinions. So I feel like, definitely like the Ukraine and Gaza are probably the main two that we talk about and should be resolved, and we should stop killing people for just a cause. In a way, they're still human beings at the end of the day, and everyone does matter. And I feel like talking about like Ukraine, Russia at the moment, what's going on in the world, Trump's babyish behavior against Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister, is something that rubs in the wrong way, I feel, with young people. I feel like when Pope passed away and Zelensky entered one of the churches, everyone applauded him, but when Trump entered, no one applauded him. And I feel like it shows also what young people feel like, but also what politicians feel like, maybe on the European level, that everyone is backing Zelensky here, but Trump is trying to mend this wall. And I feel like it's not just him that's trying to mend this wall, there's the entire world and younger generations are trying to. But with his own views on it, I feel like it could erupt probably to a worse consideration.
Well, I think he's created more conflict, in himself. Like, he's building a movement of kind of far right popularism and polarization, and that globally, we're just seeing that, taking effect globally. But we're seeing kind of people being alienated from that kind of him and his, far right policies and his, enabling of genocide, definitely, like what you're saying. But I also think there's like kind of a scary element of it, like he is building momentum, like he's building followers, like he got into power again, and that's wild. And we've just seen here in the UK, we've just had local elections that's just got loads and loads of local reform candidates, which is kind of, Reform Party in the UK is kind of far right party led by Nigel Farage, and they've got an unprecedented amount of local candidates into local governments. And that's just, I'm still off the back of that really kind of confused and just like what is going on in the world about that. Like, these people that are literally enabling genocide, creating like such like horrific living standards for young people, but for all kind of marginalized people in any way, really. And yeah, it's very scary, and I think we're seeing that, like, it's like, say, across Europe, but across the world too. Like, and for Annabelle can comment on Canada as well. I mean, you obviously just had your elections, but how does it feel like in your side of the world?
For sure, yeah. I was going to say, I obviously can't comment too much about like the European impacts of what's going on like elsewhere in the world, but from here in Canada, I was thinking about how, figures like Greta Thunberg are labeled as like a representative for young people, and they're like the voice of youth, and youth have this reputation of being activists and change makers. But when I reflect on my own life, honestly, a lot of my friends in my personal life, like they also have that same like apathy towards a lot of social issues. And I think that young people really target older generations and current people of power. And sometimes maybe it's also important to remember that like we will, as we're growing older, we'll be those people next in the government, in the parliament, like aging out of youth in a way. Because I saw a statistic for like Canada's election and elections in Canada at large, not just a specific one, but young people have one of the lowest voting turnouts. And voting is one of the easiest ways of civic engagement. And there are a lot of obviously valid excuses why people don't vote, such as, not having enough time to educate themselves due to work, due to school, due to other commitments. But I also like personally know a number of people who could very well vote and have the capacity to do so, but genuinely just don't care enough to do so and to educate themselves on different parties' campaigns and things like that. And they don't see it really affecting them much. So yeah, that was something on my mind as well, is how, and we're talking about social media too, and our algorithms, but as people very actively involved in like the movement, in the environmental movement, or like youth education, youth advocacy, I think, yeah, sometimes even I forget that like I'm seeing all of this content and I'm seeing all of this momentum because I am part of that. And there are a lot of young people who aren't part of that movement at all. I would say, the majority actually of young people at least that I know, aren't activists, aren't, change makers, and aren't really interested in doing so either. So I don't know, that was something that was on my mind.
No, I completely agree with that because, yeah, it does feel like we're in an echo chamber sometimes because it's the same here in the UK. Young people have the lowest voter turnout, and it's like, make it make sense because they seem to be very loud on social media, and like there seems to be a really like strong portion of them that are out on the streets taking action, but like how that doesn't feel like it's actually followed through, right? At the polling stations, actually in those places of power. And I was just looking at our notes for this episode, and Lucy, I think you wrote this really good point that I really want to bring up. But you wrote a question that was, are we included in the conversation or just reacting to the decisions made for us? And I was like, I feel like that's the question we're getting at here. Like, are we just kind of sitting, are we just the type of people, because we're activists and we're just kind of sitting in this echo chamber, are we just kind of shouting about it because like we can and we feel we have a voice to, or like young people at large, are we just kind of just reacting to what's happening? Like, are we actually part of this conversation? Are we actually having the change? Are the young people in Palestine actually having their voices heard on a global scale, like in the places of power where decisions are being made? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel definitely that question is working with like UK Youth and National Youth Strategy at the moment. It's something that I feel like the young people we work with are aware of those issues, are aware they want to raise their issues, their opinions about what's happening in the world and what's happening specifically in the UK in this case. But I feel like we still need a lot of work to reach those communities, those young people, those children that are from disadvantaged background or ethnic minorities or don't have a phone. Like completely not having a phone, you don't have access to these kinds of informations or opportunities you have. And I feel like it's something that we should make sure that everyone does get those informations, but also the right sort of information, not the filtered one. I feel like we're a generation that wants raw and reality and not just something that was washed by media or by some like CNN with like Trump or that kind of thing. I feel like we do made our own opinion in these spaces, but it's just for us to get there is another issue. I feel like looking, for example, in my home country, Belgium, there's not a lot of young people in politics. There's zero. We're, for the first time in history, we're having a nearly far right party in the Flemish side, which is scary because everyone's like, they're cutting every social commitment and rules we're having right now, and everyone's feeling like the burden of it. And young people are massively impacted about this because they feel like you're already touching the middle class, which is now maybe more poverty than middle class. And young people feel like they can't raise their voices in Belgium, that it's very difficult for us to enter those spaces. Whereas in the UK, you maybe have a bit more possibilities. But definitely in Belgium, like I think the first time in my entire life of like seeing a massive rally about politics was last year. And it was about Gaza, but also the far right parties coming into place and touching also the LGBT plus community rules and procedures in that. And I feel like we deserve to be in those spaces. We need to be in those spaces to have our voices heard on political issues, international conflicts, on like what's happening, because we're the direct generation having an impact on. Like our grandparents, unfortunately, are going to be dead by the end of 50 years, but we're the ones that are still living at that point will have the repercussions of that. And I feel like it's also the same when we talk about climate and the climate urgency around it and political parties not actually doing anything on the ground for us to have a good planet and looking after it. And you could see like maybe what we're doing on the ground on like little simple steps of sorting out your bins or growing a garden, that kind of thing. But it does matter. But if we have politics and laws to stop big firms, big companies like Coca-Cola in Latin America going on indigenous land and just not really considering anyone in that when they're taking that land. I feel like it's something that should be addressed. I'm also thinking like in Brazil, when the old president wanted to go in the Amazon forest and take a part of it just to make, I don't know, one of his ludicrous plans again. And I was just like, you can't touch that. I'm pretty sure it's protected, but still he could, because he was the president. And I'm like, you need procedures to stop those people in order to not like touch what we think is important as a society, as young people.
Yeah, definitely. I think it does feel like that, doesn't it? Like all these things that we're doing, like, do they have any effect? Like, yeah, I feel like we're taught that we got to do everything we can to like help the earth or like help people like that are affected by these conflicts and things like that. But it's like, actually the system at large doesn't represent us and doesn't, you know, represent those people that it's effectively killing, or the people and the young people whose future is at stake right now. Like, then it's just gonna fail, and it's just gonna be, yeah. Let's put a down on it. You know what I mean? It does feel like that, doesn't it? It feels like you're really powerless. And like, my day job is working with refugees, and many of them are young people and young women, majoritively, who I work with from these different kind of countries. A lot of them are kind of fleeing these conflicts, and like, you know, it's really interesting to speak to them, and you know, they're just trying to survive. You know what I mean? Like I feel like most young people, wherever you are in the world, like being conflict or not, like just trying to survive and trying to get through the day. And like, these people aren't actually represented in any of these spaces. It's just completely taken away from them. People like Trump, people, you know, there's people that you're saying far right people in power, they're just completely like trumping over everything, like trumping everything. But you know what I mean? And like billionaires and these people, and it's like, when are we actually going to have the power to influence these things? Because they are destroying like our present and everything that we know to be true today, and affecting us right now. But think about right now, and then think about what they're doing to the future, like, right, you know, and that's our future. That's when we are going to be their age, and like, then what are we left with? You know, like, they're a mess, and essentially. But yeah, it just makes me think, yeah, what voice do we have, and what power and what agency do we have in the face of these really massive, big things that are going on in the world? Yeah.
I mean, I also see a note that we've written down, right? Like, what can we actually do right now? It seems so tough. When you read all of the headlines, every time I open the news now, I can't imagine being a journalist and having to stay on top of everything and report on everything. It seems insane to me, but I think there are a lot of practical things and tangible actions that we can actually do, not just young people, but anyone who wants to get involved. I would say, off the top of my mind, one is definitely media literacy, especially through recent conflicts and events and wars. We're able to see how different news channels in different countries report on different events, you know, biases that are in headlines, just strategic messaging that is like purposefully trying to paint a situation in a certain light. So I think media literacy is definitely something that's very important. And a lot of young people, you know, will laugh at their parents for not being able to tell if something is like AI generated or if something is fake news or not. But that really applies to young people as well. Like, you know, there are certain channels or certain like media platforms that we might trust more than others, and not necessarily be diligently fact checking everything. So I think that's one thing that comes up on the top of my mind. And then, I mean, we talked a lot about like political systems and how we're not represented in them as activists. And I think for sure, like, dismantling systems and transforming our systems is a conversation to be had as well. And while that work is happening simultaneously, there also needs to be young people who are like joining these systems in a way, whether it's like running for office or, voting. I don't know. I think there's something to be said about, I don't know if like infiltration is the right word, but like participating in the systems and changing them from within, like while that other work outside is happening as well.
I feel like in terms of education, there needs to be a lot more of resources, even like a course for like secondary year high school students, just to know the politics in their own country, on like how to vote, what age you can vote. I know it's very different, like even between Belgium and the UK. In Belgium, you can vote from the age of 16. In the UK, it's 18, I think. But also in Belgium, it's compulsory to vote. So we don't particularly have the choice because we're a small country as well. But I feel like the fact of us having this compulsory vote, I think a lot of people do their research before going to vote. And I feel like it needs to be more addressed in high school for us as young people to understand our political systems, but also what's going on in the world. Like in terms of like genocides or current conflicts ongoing, I feel like we should have this sort of like courses for young people, even for like maybe kids a bit, to just address what's happening in the world and how to relate, how to get the information, what's happening, how do you feel about it, and just checking in with them as well, because I feel like it's topics that should be addressed for young people. It's not because we're under 18 that we're still kids that we don't understand things. I feel like it's a regular comment that older generations would say, but I feel like no, we actually want to know what's going on. We actually want to know maybe the history of it or that type of thing. I'm thinking like even in Belgium, I never learnt the history of Congo, and we colonized Congo, and never learnt that in history. And I feel like it's something that we should learn because it's our country's history. It's really bad, but we should learn it. And I feel like it's also taking considerations from what's happening in the past to not do the same mistakes right now in the present, but also for us to understand the whole conflict as a whole. Like even the Israel-Gaza, it's been ongoing since the 1950s. And you need to know this sort of like previous history to understand the conflict right now. And I feel like it comes back to education, and also like us as young people also staying connected between us, trying to support each other in youth activism or like protests that we can do for our politicians to actually address issues and take accountability into that. But it does take a long time, unfortunately. But I feel like resilience is a massive point here, and just trying to disturb the world in what we would like to shape it in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think definitely I agree with all of that. All that you both said. I think political education feels so important. I think our lack of political education is being weaponized against us. Like that feels so crucial. But you've already kind of really well explained that. And yeah, and I think obviously I got a bit down in the dumps about like the helplessness of it all, and it does feel like that. Like I'm going to be honest, like we said we were going to be honest on this podcast, it does feel like that. But I think how we can like combat that is, like you say, staying connected and community building and mutual aid. And I just think that is so important. Like having a community, having people that you support and that support you, feels really important. And I've really found, like we talk about Gaza, I've really found a community in my local area over the past couple of years around that, joining my local Palestine solidarity group. It really like taught me everything I know about Palestine, just speaking to people on the street at these demos, but then also just like I feel part of a community. That's very nice. But also I also thought about showing up is definitely something we can do, and I feel like that just can't be taken for granted. Like showing up in whatever way you can, like, and I mean that in that, like you're talking about, and about like being like media literate and showing up online in different ways, but showing up on the streets, putting ourselves, when we're not represented, putting ourselves in front of the camera so that we are, putting ourselves at the front, putting ourselves, or pushing the other people that need to be seen in certain instances to the front, in all senses of the way. At these conferences where we're going to, you were talking about in the European Union, Lucy, where someone did stand up with the Palestinian flag, like, I just think that is like, feels really important, because if no one's talking, if no one's shouting, then no one's going to hear us, right? And that feels really important, because if we're all shouting, then we can't be ignored. And that feels like it really comes back to our kind of the quote that's in our kind of intro of our podcast around like being an imperfect activist, around like feeling like we have to do everything and be a perfect activist, when actually it's better to have millions of us all trying to do something and trying and speaking up and showing up where we can, than just like a few people trying to do it a little bit. Because if millions of us are doing it, then like we can't be ignored. And we have seen that in response to these conflicts. And like you say, at the polling stations in Canada, we've just seen, you know, like the far right not getting into power, and that has been shown throughout history, right? And that feels really important to reiterate. And it feels like maybe saying the obvious there, but I just think, yeah, that feels important. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a really good conversation, I think. And I mean, we could talk for hours about this, and we'll continue to embed some of these themes into our future episodes, just about obviously the role of youth in anything, and our like capacity to act as youth, what we believe as young people, etc. Tasha, I was wondering if you wanted to kind of tease your next episode.
Yeah, there's lots of exciting episodes coming up where we're going to talk a bit more detail. It feels hard, doesn't it, to fit everything into one episode, and when we talk about these big things. But yeah, in the next episode, I'm going to be talking to some youth activists and taking it back to talking about Greta Thunberg earlier, taking it back to the youth strike for climate days, and thinking about where we've come as a movement from 6 years ago, when myself and lots of us around the globe were striking from school, and what that means for us now, being activists or not activists in the world since then. Yeah.
That's super exciting. I'm really excited to hear about it. I mean, there's so many misconceptions about, I guess, like the impact of rallying and going to protests. A lot of people, you know, think that that's kind of just creating noise and not any tangible impact. But I recently saw there was a news article published that I don't have on hand at the moment, but it was talking about like the actual impacts of rallies and protests and how they genuinely do change people's minds, and they were able to quantify some of that impact, which is really cool. So I would definitely go back looking for that.
Oh, great convo, gals. And yeah, I guess see you on the next episode.
Yeah. Love it. Thank you so much for listening to our first podcast of The Imperfect Activist. We'll be releasing episodes every other Friday, and you can get them wherever you get your podcasts through the Be The Change Media Network. You can also find us on Instagram at theimperfectactivist.podcast and on LinkedIn. Be sure to check out all the other amazing podcasts by young people on the Be The Change Media Network. Until next time, bye!
We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones.
Young people, you know, well, we're the future. We've got everything to fight for.